It is a foggy night in 1898. The SS La Bourgogne is sailing at full speed approximately 60 miles south of Sable Island, Nova Scotia. Her visibility is down to 20 yards, but that is okay. The ocean is big, the water is deep, and save for a distant foghorn, no other ships are seemingly around, and there is no danger to the passenger liner. Best to just run her ahead at full speed and get out of the fog as soon as possible. On board are 726 people. The time is just before 5 a.m. on July 4th, 1898, and all is well. In 30 minutes, 549 people will be dead. On this night, tranquility is about to be shattered. Launched in 1885, the French passenger liner SS La Bourgogne sailed on her maiden voyage to New York in June 1886, and destiny saw her enjoy a 12-year career following her successful and triumphant crossing to New York, a trip she made in only 7 days, something which sparked an entirely new surge in the transatlantic crossing race. She had 2 stacks, 4 masts, was 449 feet long, had a beam of 52 feet, a single screw, could reach an impressive speed of 17 knots, and could carry within her accommodations 390 first-class passengers, 65 second-class passengers, and 600 third-class passengers. Despite starting off well, her career, however, was filled with a few incidents which, sadly in hindsight, were almost prophetic. In 1896, she collided with and sank a British steamship called the Elisa, anchored in New York Harbor. And she was also involved in another collision with the SS Toreador, which damaged her stern, but she did not sink. Other than these collisions, her initial 12 years of sailing were mostly by the book and routine. On July 3rd, 1898, La Bourgogne left New York for Le Havre for what should have been a typical trip. Early in the morning, on July 4th, she was around 50 to 60 nautical miles south of Sable Island, Nova Scotia. The fog was dense, but all was well. The clocks slowly ticked as the minutes went by. Her crew were antsy to get into clear weather, but kept the ship sailing at full speed rather than stop and try to wait it out. Her visibility was down to 20 yards, but La Bourgogne plows ahead at full speed. All is well. In the distance, a foghorn is blowing. What would happen next would be so horrific that the French government would attempt to cover it up and bury it forever. The Cromartyshire was an iron-hulled sailing vessel built in 1879 by Russell & Co. at Port Glasgow. On the early morning hours of July 4th, 1898, she was 50 to 60 nautical miles south of Sable Island. The fog is dense on this morning, and she is blowing her horn. She can hear a whistle in the distance, but she cannot determine where exactly in the fog it is coming from. Visibility is down to 20 yards, so she plows on cautiously ahead into the fog. There are debating recounts of what happened next. Some say that she was sailing at full speed, others say it was the La Bourgogne, others say it was both ships. But either way, for both ships, suddenly it was clear that they were not so alone as they thought, or that the ship that they could hear in the distance was in fact not so far away, because suddenly they can see each other at 20 yards away. The ships smash into each other. There was no immediately calm afterward like there was on the Titanic or the Arctic, where it would be long before the passengers would know for sure that their ship was sinking. Rather, the SS La Bourgogne immediately took a list to starboard. And that wasn't the worst of it. Not only was it clear that the ship had taken a crippling, perhaps mortal wound, but many of her lifeboats on the starboard side were smashed in the collision and rendered useless. and the ones on the port could not be lowered because of the increasing list of the ship. Similarly to the SS Arctic in the 1850s, which also suffered a collision on her starboard side. The La Bourgogne immediately began to settle by the stern and go under. And all hell broke loose on board. The tranquil night was shattered, calamities spread around the ship, and everything that could go wrong seemed like it was going wrong. As passengers scrambled to get out of the sinking ship and on deck, the crew just began to throw whatever, not whoever, but whatever, onto the lifeboats and launched them, hardly giving the passengers a sideways glance, and that was perhaps the best of what was done. Other crew members decided to not just ignore the pleading passengers. Instead, they used their fists or the oars to beat back passengers as they tried to get into the boats, and a few passengers were even stabbed by some of the crew as they attempted to climb into the lifeboats. The horror wasn't over yet, though. Passengers were calling out for help from the deck, pleading with the crew as they were being abandoned. Others were jumping from the ship, and others still were scrambling to escape the inside as it flooded. A wave of water gushed through the halls, rising in a tumultuous flood like blood seeping in from an open wound. Trapped passengers called for help, but no one came, and the ship continued to sink. And they couldn't get out, and they were left inside as the crew abandoned them all. Remember, this all also occurred not one day after leaving port, and for many passengers, to learn the layout of the interior of a passenger liner like this could take a few days. Now they had to try and escape a ship that they were not familiar with as it rolled more onto its side, rendering stairwells out useless, and all the while, a flood of water was chasing them and rising around their legs. The collision had occurred around amidships on the starboard side, and many of the passengers were asleep. Remember, this was 5 a.m., and many of the passengers awoke from the crash or were thrown from their beds by it, stumbling out into the hall to meet a wave of water that quickly grew knee-high, then waist-high, then chest-high. And the weight of the water pulling on the ship onto her starboard side meant, again, that they had to try to navigate the vessel as the world slowly rolled sideways around them. They were half awake, confused, scared, panicking, and trying to escape a ship that they didn't know all the ways out of. Perhaps those on the port side had a slight advantage. The water wouldn't have been around their ankles, essentially, as soon as they got out of their rooms. But for those on the starboard side, it was almost a guaranteed death sentence. Nothing short of a true nightmare to imagine. And what valiant actions played out inside the ship, we may never know. Someone holding a door open for someone helping another person up, someone freeing someone from their cabin, or someone who was trapped in the rubble from the collision, was all in vain, as, due to an undisciplined rush for the lifeboats, almost all the passengers were left behind to take their chances on the ship. SS La Bourgogne sank in 30 minutes. 30 minutes that were nothing short of hell on earth. The last minutes of the sinking were described like this. The last few minutes on board the Bourgogne witnessed some of the most terrible scenes of horror and cruelty that have blotted the history of a civilized race. Instead of heroic discipline, which so often has been the one bright feature of such awful moments, the crew of the steamer fought like demons for the few lifeboats and rafts, battering the helpless passengers away from their only means of salvation, with the result that the strong overcame the weak, and the list of 162 saved contains the name of but one woman. It sends a chill down your spine. It paints a horrific, vivid image, because getting to hear the words of someone who was there, someone who was alive when this happened, it makes it feel far more real than simply reading a write-up about it nowadays. Of the 726 people on board, 549 were lost. Among those lost included Turkish wrestler Yusuf Ismail, whose career led him to face American champion Evan Strangler Lewis in front of 10,000 people, and he won. He claimed this victory in a Championship of the World event. Lewis said afterward, "I was licked. The Turk is the better man." Ismail was traveling on the La Bourgogne to return to his native village and open a coffee shop or a small market. He never got the chance. French painter Leon Porta was also lost in the sinking. One time, he got to feature one of his paintings in an exhibit of fine art. Many of his works are now proudly housed in several art museums around the world. Leon was only 30 years old. Also lost was American painter D. Scott Evans, who was a teacher and the head of the art department at Mount Union College in Ohio until 1875. He was known for his genre paintings of stylish women in rich settings. He and his 3 daughters were all lost in the disaster. His wife was not on board and later remarried. Others who were lost included Catholic priest Father Anthony Kessler of New York, American Orthodox priest Reverend Stephen der Stephanian, along with his wife and 3 children. 3 members of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, which Leon Porta was a part of. The wife and daughter of John Forrest Dillon, an American attorney in Iowa, were also all lost in the sinking. Survivors said that the ship's officers remained at their post after the collision until the end. The 4th engineer and the purser were the only officers who survived. The ship's captain, all of the deck officers, and most of the engineer officers died in the sinking. Survivors said that only the ship's 2nd officer made any kind of true attempt to launch the lifeboats with passengers on board. And according to others, the ship's captain remained on the bridge until the end. He went down with his ship. Surviving crew members were met with furious mobs upon their arrival in New York due to the accounts of them beating off and stabbing passengers, many of whom were Americans. They required police protection upon their arrival to not be lynched by the mob. The French government later covered up the tragedy and blamed none of the sailors of their nationality for the sinking, only those who were working on the ship who were of foreign nationality. You might wonder, what happened to the Chromatishire? After the collision, she lost sight of the La Bourgogne and did not know how severely damaged she has been. At least, not until the fog thinned. They thought the alarm bells and rockets coming from the other ship as she sank were an offer for assistance, when in reality, La Bourgogne was pleading for help. Meanwhile, the Chromatishire's captain did an inspection of his vessel and found the bow severely damaged, but the Chromatishire did not sink. Once it was clear that the La Bourgogne had sunk, the Chromatishire picked up 173 survivors from the water, some from La Bourgogne's boats, and some from her own, which were launched to assist in the rescue. Among those saved, less than 70 of them were passengers. The survivor ratio was 13% of the total passengers, and of the crew, the total was 48% of all those who had been on board. Only 1 woman of the 300 on board survived. No children who had been on board survived. Almost all of the first-class passengers died, with survivors mostly consisting of sailors and steerage passengers. The lack of any women and children surviving, the chaos of the crew essentially abandoning the passengers, has caused many to associate the phrase, "women and children last," with this disaster. As for the SS La Bourgogne, she has never been found. All we know is that her wreck lies somewhere on the same ocean floor as more famous wrecks like the Titanic. The sinking in which women and children first was most famously put to use. Unlike this disaster, this is not the kind of disaster history likes to remember. There was no honor and glory to the end. And thus she, and her horrifically tragic story, and her passengers have almost been completely forgotten. Let's make the effort to remember them, and make sure that nothing like this ever happens again.